Hello, everyone, and welcome to FECast episode 30. I am your host, Sunyveil, and today I am joined by fellow Worlds competitor Collecter, who took down the latest ECQ. How's it going, Collector?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, except for the fact that it's like 99 degrees today. But boy, there's been a lot of exciting things happening in Eternal. You and me both qualifying for Worlds. I think that, it's legitimate for us to be excited about that. And also this tournament that's coming up this weekend. Let's talk about the ECQ you won. So you took down this Expedition tournament with Skycrag Jonkers. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yep. So we wanted to make a deck that played Jack, because it's probably one of the best cards in the format, without also losing to other Jack decks. So we took a bunch of bodies that were X5s or larger, along with Jack, and just threw in some removal and, played that.
So you didn't try to play the objectively most powerful deck necessarily, or the most foolproof deck, but rather one that was really well positioned against certain cards in the metagame that were seeing a lot of play.
Right. You weren't really vulnerable to Jack, you weren't really vulnerable to Blazing Salvo. Like, Salvo could still kill a unit, but they'd be 2 for 1ing themselves every time they want to do that. So you end up grinding out, the lower to the ground decks, assuming that, you don't just die in the first 3 turns. And you have enough tools to not die in the first 3 turns between Sears and Lightning Strikes and things along those lines.
Yeah, I was very excited seeing you win the entire tournament. I'm sure a lot of other people were. We've actually had this interview previously, right after you won the tournament. I was able to grab you for a quick interview. If anyone wants to check out that one, that will be linked in the description of this, unless you would rather spend more time talking about your victory here, Collector.
I'm good, thanks.
All right. On to tournaments that are coming up. We do know that there's going to be an ECQ next month. It's probably going to be Throne. It's probably going to involve the new set, which is also coming out next month. But no dates, to my knowledge, have been given out for that. Again, we'll keep you updated when those do come. But there is a tournament this weekend. Jedi EJ is hosting another Peasant tourney, meaning that you can only use commons and uncommons, and it's going to be best of 3. And there's prize support, but there's also prize support supplied by Direwolf.
I do want to note that by next month, Sunny means this month. The Throne ECQ is going to be this month, as well as the new set.
Oh, shoot. It's June, isn't it?
It is June now, yeah.
All right. I think we're still a ways off. But in any case, this tournament is going to be on Saturday. It's going to start at 9 a.m. Pacific. And best of 3 Swiss rounds, playoff for top 8. Prize support, definitely check it out if you manage to catch this announcement in time, or if you've been on Reddit and know about it already. It's really cool to see a community-run tournament and Direwolf putting up some prize support for it.
Yep, I even think there's some prize support for most creative decks, so even if you're not the strongest player, you still have a chance to win something. So,
are you going to be playing this tournament, Collector?
We'll see. I might be busy this weekend, but if I'm not, I probably will.
How's your motivation going as far as Eternal goes right now?
I mean, being already qualified, the motivation to keep up with draft and whatnot has definitely fallen a bit. But, I'm still gonna, put some time in to help the rest of my team try to make Worlds. So.
Oh, that's awesome. I think that's more than I can say right now. Have I opened up Eternal since the last ECQ? I don't think so. Anyway, but we are here to talk about something that doesn't require recent knowledge of the game. This is a general topic to help you improve your game overall. The big topic for today is going to be how to improve your gameplay. Now, this is going to be completely independent of deck selection and deck tuning and basically what cards you're going to have in your deck. This is just when you sit down, what are the things that you can do to improve your play and maximize your chances if you're playing in day 2 of an ECQ or something like that. Because I think that players have a lot of agency over what happens in their game, and I think that since there are some games in which that's not the case, people tend to believe that they are not a real player in more games than what is actual reality. Do you think you'd agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I know we're not talking about it much, but deck selection is half of the tournament. But the other half is, like you're saying, trying to optimize your chances at every step of the game to play, and that really starts with your opening hand.
Right, yes. Deck selection is absolutely a huge part of it. If your cards are just inherently better than your opponents, like if you're coming with a constructed deck and your opponent's coming with a draft deck, you're going to be tremendously advantaged, and it's probably more than what you can do in-game. But once you're in the game, you're immediately presented with perhaps the most important decision you're going to make in that game, and that is the keep or redraw. What do you look for when you see see your first 7 cards, and you have that red button and that green button in front of you, and you're wondering which one to press.
I mean, so it's going to be hard to give, just generic, always do this advice because, it's always highly, deck dependent. And it also kind of depends on if you're day 2 of an ECQ and you know your opponent's deck list, you can know that you have to mulligan for a certain combination of cards to survive the early game, maybe, or that, you're versing control decks, so you want to mulligan away that opening hand that has 3 permafrost in it, whereas, if you're versing a Praxis aggro, you would snap keep that. But in general, I try to, have my opening hand, at least 3 power, so that you can actually do some things with your hand. Preferably some kind of early interaction, whether or not that be a unit or like a Defiance or something along those lines. And then, hopefully just kind of a plan of where to go from there.
Yeah, of course, it's difficult to talk about this in specific terms because it is so vague depending on the matchup and whatnot. But I think something that people don't necessarily realize is that whenever you're presented with that decision, the red button that says redraw and the green button that says keep, sometimes that green button says concede as well. Like, there's going to be some portion of time, if that hand is unplayable, that button is going to say concede. And if you press it when it says concede, you lose the game. You're conceding. The red button never exactly says concede for sure, but there you do run the risk of redrawing into 6 cards that don't really do anything and conceding that way. But I think it's very important to never press the green button when it says concede. Look at your hand, make sure that it does what you need to do to be able to win the game. You were talking about day 2 of an ECQ, you know what the matchup is. Even if it's not day 2 and you just happen to know what your opponent's on. Like, for example, if you're playing an aggressive deck against control, you really do not want your removal because those are dead cards. If you have a 7-card hand, that's great, except it has 1 piece of removal, that's probably fine. But if you have a 7-card hand that has like 2 pieces of removal and like 1 big high investment threat, that might be good in the mirror, but that's not going to do anything against a control deck. And I think if you press the green button in a situation like that, even though it's a 7-card hand that might have a good mix of things to do and power to play it, it might just be giving up the game right then and there.
Yeah, I mean, that's hard to control for on ladder because, most of the time you don't know what your opponent's on. So just keeping the hands that, in general, are good against either a wide array or just, I'm absolutely going to destroy the, 2 of the 3 archetypes, between the control, mid-range, and aggro that are out there. Combo doesn't exist too much in Eternal.
Right.
It's probably worth keeping.
Would you say that you should redraw more aggressively on day 2 of an ACQ than in the first 28 games?
Yeah, I'll often redraw more aggressively in the day 2 of an ECQ because I know what I'm actually looking for. I know what I'm looking for in general. Like, when I go into a game, with that Skycrag deck, it would have been a Seer, maybe a Wisdom of the Elders, and 3 or 4 power. But if I'm going into day 2 of ECQ, I know I'm versing Praxis aggro or something, so I might want to have a Permafrost, a Lightning Strike, 3 power or something that's enough to keep me alive in the early game before I can start landing my chunky units. But if I know I'm versing the Cambrai Relics deck in Expedition, I would want that hand of the Permafrost and Lightning Strike. I'm shipping that away super fast because that's there's already 2 dead cards. It's not going to do anything.
All right, here's another scenario. Say you're playing some sort of deck that has Gavel in the market and Reanimator is your opponent. So basically what you're trying to do is you're getting to 3 power and playing a Merchant and then playing Gavel, or getting to 4 power and playing it on that turn. Your opening hand only has 2 power. How aggressively are you keeping the hand with a hate card for the matchup that you're in, knowing that if you can play it, you're very likely to win the game? Or 2 power Hailstorm against an aggressive deck.
I'm always more likely to keep those hands in the draw because you do have that extra card to get there, especially for things like Hailstorm, because you want them to commit more to the board before you Hailstorm anyway. But as far as singular hate cards that are pretty much game ending when you play them, I will aggressively mulligan for them, even to 6. I know in one of the previous ECQs I played against the Boxer, and he had Gavel in the market when I was on the Animator. Game 1, he got it on turn, marketed for a turn 3, he played a turn 4, and I just lost. There's nothing I could do. If the hate card's strong enough, it's worth going for, even going down a card.
Right. That was part of our saga of me inviting the Boxer onto the show and the person that beat him in the ECQ, right?
Yeah.
And then eventually he won so many times that there was no one who could beat him. And well, anyway. Yeah. So basically, you kind of have to treat it like you're playing even-handed golem on day 2 of an ECQ. You really got to be aggressive with those redraws, because sometimes if you're pressing the green button, you might be accidentally conceding before the game even starts and not giving yourself a chance.
Yep.
Once you're in the game, I think that the first few turns are of utmost importance. Any mistake you make in the early turns of the game are going to be compounded every turn thereafter. Like, for example, if you missequence something and you could have had an extra 2-1 on turn 3, and later down the line you just don't have an opportunity to deploy that unit or whatever, that 2-1 potentially could get in for 8 damage or something before you're able to correct that mistake, and that's definitely something that can swing a game. And I think a lot of times where this comes up is being efficient with power early on, making sure that your early plays are the impactful ones that you need to make early on in the game. For example, if you're playing a game and you have a couple 2-drops in your hand and a 3-drop, and you play a 2-drop on turn 2 and 2-drop on turn 3, and then on turn 4 you play the 3-drop, but you drew a second 2-drop, you could have had that extra 2-drop for free. You basically gave up the 2 power between turns 3 and 4, and that can be a huge difference. That can swing the game. The other example, I think, is when you go to the market on turn 3 and you make the wrong market choice. I think that is an incredibly impactful decision, the early market choice, that can really go wrong if you're not careful with it.
Yeah, I mean, with merchants, oftentimes, merchanting on 3 isn't necessarily correct, because the game just hasn't developed to a point where you actually need any of the cards in your market and your hand is still good right now. Because you'll often be swapping out a piece of gas for a slightly better piece of gas. So unless you need the attacker, or it's relevant that you're playing an Aurelian Merchant or something, it can sometimes be better to just hold it for a couple of turns, swap out that that 6th power that you drew that you don't need, and actually get something that can help you win.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I wouldn't advocate playing merchants on 3 unless you absolutely have to. I mean, merchants are below rate for good reason, because the marketability is so powerful. Usually on the early turns of the game, you're trying to be as impactful as you can.
Yeah, and sometimes game plans feed into it, FJS will merchant on 3 so that they can do regions 2 on 4. Sometimes control decks will rarely merchant on 3 so that they can harsh roll on 5. Harsh roll the next turn rather at 5. But you want to have a plan when you're doing it. You don't just want to go, well, I'm just going to merchant because there's nothing else to do this turn.
Yeah, hopefully there's something else to do. All right, let me give you another situation. You're playing an aggressive deck. You play units on turns 1, 2, and 3, and you know your opponent is playing Hailstorms. They play a depleted power on turn 3, and they can't play Hailstorm. What do you do on turn 4? I feel like that's a huge decision that can definitely make or break the game, because if your opponent doesn't have a Hailstorm or a sweeper that they can play on the follow-up turn, and you're ahead on board on turn 4, you play 2 more 2-drops or something, they basically can't win if they do not have a way of sweeping it up. But on the other hand, you're totally dry if your opponent just sweeps up those 2 extra cards for free. Basically, you're giving your opponent those 2 cards. Do you have any tips? I have some in mind, but do you have any tips on what to do if you're playing an aggro deck against a deck that potentially has sweepers?
On ladder, I'd say definitely just go for it. You don't want to give away a bunch of free wins because you're playing too scared. And that ladder is, aggro, is fast enough that even if you guess wrong and they actually end up having it, just go to the next game. But I don't know. That's a tough one for an actual tournament where you have to think hard about it, because it kind of depends on the rest of your hand. If you have enough follow up that you can commit the extra creature, up the turn clock by a turn or 2, and still have gas if they do have the Hailstorm, then yeah, you can probably play at least one out. But if you don't have anything to follow it up with, I guess the main question becomes then, if you were to play them both out, you have nothing to follow it up with. The main question becomes then, even if they Hailstorm what you currently have on board, is the 1 or 2 units left in your hand going to be good enough to win the game? And I'd say the answer to that is often not. Maybe if it's 2 Milos or something, it probably could be. But if it's another Oni Ronin and something like that, it's those aren't good enough to win on their own.
Yeah, I think the first thing you want to do is make sure that if you are playing around a card, make sure you can actually beat that card. If you're playing around the turn 5 harsh roll by not playing your 4-drop, make sure that that 4-drop is enough to win you the game after they harsh roll, because if you're playing around a card and you can't beat it anyway, you're just giving up percentage points. As far as sweepers go with aggro decks, I think something that's really important to do is look at what they've done the previous few turns. So if your opponent played undepleted power turn 2, depleted power on turn 3, I can almost guarantee you they do not have the Hailstorm, and you should just go for it. Because they could have played that power undepleted on turn 3. They could have set it up their hand so that they would be able to Hailstorm on turn 3. And I think that's something that people overlook is looking closely at what your opponent's power is. You can go back and check. There's next to
the portrait.
Right. You can click on their power and see exactly what they played. You can see if they played a seat, if it was depleted, you'll know that they don't have a sigil in hand. If it was undepleted and they played a depleted power anyway after that probably means that they're setting up for a turn 4 play and not turn 3 play. So I think that a lot of information can be gained by seeing how your opponent develops their early game. Like, does it seem like they're digging for something, in which case, probably go for it? Does it seem like they're just setting up for that Hailstorm by playing, maybe they're playing a merchant when they went against a board of X1s and they already have the Hailstorm in hand? I feel like you can get a lot of information based on what your opponent does, and it's often overlooked. The other thing is that if your opponent has a good opportunity to sweep and they don't take it, like say they play their 3rd power undepleted and they don't sweep, and you have, even 2 units on board, that probably means that they just don't have it, and you should just go for it. I guess a lot of this is just saying, go for it, but I think that there's a lot of situations where it might look like someone's being super aggressive or super greedy by going for it, in situations where it's actually pretty safe because they can tell that their opponent doesn't have it based on how they're playing. Another big thing, while we're on the topic of information, is let's say you're playing some sort of mid-range mirror. You play your big 4-drop that doesn't have immediate impact on the board, that's really vulnerable to removal. Your opponent has 1 card in hand. They draw their card. They play Seek Power, and then they pass the turn. What do you think your opponent has?
You said this is a mid-range mirror?
Yeah, it's some sort of mid-range mirror.
I'm going to guess that they have 2 power in hand.
Exactly. That's what I think. Anytime your opponent plays a Seek Power, you can almost guarantee that is the card that they drew. I'm talking about sometime in the late game. Same for something like Strategize. Strategize might not be the best example because that one actually benefits from having some fodder in hand.
I often say that towards the end. So
yeah. But like if your opponent just plays, like say you play a big unit and your opponent plays a slightly smaller unit late in the game, they probably just drew that unit, right? I think that's especially true with decks that just have a lot of units. Late in the game, if they have a card they're sitting on, they draw a card, they play a medium-sized unit that they weren't waiting on power or anything, that probably means that they just drew that unit. And you can be reasonably confident that your opponent doesn't have it. I think a lot of people get paralyzed by late game situations, and it's like, what if my opponent has this? But I think a lot of the times you can rule it out based on what they do or don't do.
Right. And like on the same vein of like trying to glean information, I know we mentioned you can look at your opponent's power to see how they're sequencing things, but it's also, especially these days, important to check if your Praxis opponents if they played a banner and if it was undepleted, because if it is, then that means they have the undepleted, they have the basic sigil for Jack, which they could have one anyway, even if they don't, but for sure if they have one to if they played one.
You're talking about seats, right?
Oh, sorry, yeah, seats, not banners. My bad.
Yeah, this is also, that's a really good tip in the era of Jack, which is, where we currently are. Now, there is probably going to be a balance patch released sometime soon that maybe should probably address Jack. So right. We may not be in the era of Jack much longer, but who knows?
Yeah, I mean, you can still use that information though to know that, okay, they have at least 1 sigil in their hand. Have they played it yet? No? Okay, then I know that of their 3 cards, at least 1 is a sigil.
Yeah, especially in open deck formats like day 2s of ECQs, you can usually try to figure out what your opponent has. I mean, most people are playing 4-ofs of almost every card in their deck. If they're holding on to cards, it's either nothing, power, or something that's useless for a market fodder. It's not going to be a unit, because if it was a unit, they'd play it. or some sort of spell that they don't want to play. And you can usually figure out what they have if they even have it. So I think that's just something that people don't do enough, and can really help them determine what the opponent has. That's like an upper level skill, I would say, is like knowing what your opponent has, right? The first thing to do is be able to make sure that you're playing well to the board, but figuring out what your opponent has and being able to play around it, I think it takes a little more time to develop.
Right. And like as far as trying to figure out what your opponent has, don't be afraid to spend some time on their end of turn to, think about A, what do they have, and B, like what are you hoping to draw? What is your game plan for the next turn? Because I've seen a lot of people, they'll just immediately pass to their turn, like sit there thinking for like the entire time and then make a quick rash decision because they started roping and they don't want to just pass the turn. So if you spend some time on the opponent's turn, like going, okay, if I were to draw, if I don't draw anything, this is what I'm doing. But if I draw something good, you can save time on your own turn and prevent yourself from having to be forced into making a decision.
While we're talking about pace of play, Collector, what percentage of players do you think play too quickly?
What percentage? I would say a lot of
I would say almost everyone. Do you play too quickly?
Depending on the day, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I know I play too quickly. I mean, I think that a lot of people would say that we're among the best technical players, but there's definitely times where I make a decision quickly and then realize that I really should have thought more about that.
Yep, I mean, I've definitely lost a game of day 2, like an ECQ before, just because I was going a little too quickly and accidentally like played the wrong power, or I knew that, okay, I'm going to do this. I go to my turn, and then I proceed not to do that because I'm going too quickly, and it feels really bad because you had a plan, and you just move too quickly to actually remember what your plan was. Not fun.
Yeah, I think that is something that everyone can take a little extra time on their turns. I know it's less exciting that way. It doesn't make for as great as an esport if people are taking extra time on their turn, but I think it really does translate to percentage points, is in making sure that the plan that you're making is the one that you really want to follow through with.
Yeah, like on ladder practice, you can practice playing quick and, like trying to build those gut reactions of what's generally the best thing to do. But when you're like trying to go to a competitive event, just try to slow down a little bit and make sure you're actually thinking through what you're doing and try to get off autopilot.
Okay, so speaking of things that the top competitive players don't do well enough, how many times do you feel like you make mistakes in games, and how often do you think those mistakes are impactful? Because I heard a comment from someone who is well respected as a player who said that in their losses, 90% of the time there was nothing they could do, and I was extremely skeptical of this claim.
Yeah, I mean, generally the only time a statement like that is true is when you're bringing a deck like, say, Diogo combo, which is something extremely, extremely linear, which there's no decision to make every turn. You're just working towards the exact same plan. But even then, there's like some choices you can do where you can choose to delay the combo a few turns to try to build up power to have like an unseal open or something along those lines. But yeah, like I'd say that there are definitely some games where you're just gonna roll over and die, and there's nothing you can do. Like you're playing a slow control deck and you never find your second justice or harsh rule, and your opponent's playing aggro and they just run you over. Maybe in game you did not make a mistake, but maybe you should have just mulliganed that opening hand because you didn't have the justice, which you often rely on, or something along those lines.
Yeah, maybe you click the concede button on turn 0 of the game. That's definitely something that could happen. I will believe you if you redrew to 6, never hit a third power, and never played a card that was not a power from your hand. But yeah, okay, so you didn't have any shot in that game. But I think a lot of the time you do have the option. You have the option of redrawing more aggressively. You have small things that people don't notice. We were talking earlier about small decisions compounding later in the game. I think that one of the most important skills in card games, and one of the skills that's the most difficult to learn, is figuring out exactly where the game turns, right? We're talking about little mistakes compounding over the course of turns. Sometimes a game could be lost on turn 3 with a market decision, or even on turn 0, like I was talking about with the redraw decision. Like that could be the game. That could be where the game is decided. I'm not saying that it's going to be that way every time, but before you go ahead and say, oh, there was absolutely nothing I can do, or like maybe I made a small mistake but it didn't end up mattering. No. Those might end up mattering. That's what I'm trying to say.
For sure. Like I know, like I've lost games before where we're playing like Fire Time Justice, right? FTJ. and then your opening hand is, say, a seat that is red-green. You have a time sigil in your hand, and then a seek power. Oftentimes people just play their seat turn 1 and fire off that seek power. But my deck requires justice, time, some amount of fire, who knows. But if I fire off that seek power turn 1, I might have just lost the game then, because I don't know what power I'm going to be drawing in the next couple turns. Delaying that a turn or two, especially if I don't have a lot of else to do in my hand, can give you a lot more information to know what you actually need to fetch influence-wise. And sometimes you just lose because you fired off turn 1, and then you just draw time power when you needed a justice.
Yeah, I mean, that could go either way, right? You could be punished because you didn't seek power on the first turn. I think that you need to take a step back, figure out, when am I going to need the undepleted power? How important is it that it's the correct influence? And then decide when to play that seek power after that. I mean, with cards like that strategize, I think that merchants are a good example. And Honor of Claws, you have to make the right informed decision, right? You have to have the right amount of information to make the decision that you're making. But on the other hand, you can't delay that decision too long, because each turn that goes by, you're giving up, all the extra power in your pool.
Yeah, I mean, something like Seek Power basically reads, play a depleted power this turn, or maybe even 2, depending on how your hand shapes up. But you just gotta know when you can fit it into your plan, and if, you're playing a deck where you just absolutely can't fit it in on a later turn, sure, do it on turn 1. But, you have to be okay with potentially getting influence screwed then.
Right, yeah. I mean, I guess that's really what all the decisions come down to, is weighing one thing against another. And this one, it is power efficiency versus making the correct decision, making a decision with enough information to make it.
Right.
Oh, do you ever watch your replays of tournament matches, Collector?
Not too often. Sometimes when I lose, I'll go back and watch them. See, there's things I could have done differently. I know that when I was versing The Rock in round 1 of that first ECQ, this last ECQ rather, there were definitely different decisions I could have taken at certain points. I'm still not sure if they would have been better decisions, but they're kind of good to go back and think about and see if your line of thinking still holds up when you're not under pressure.
Absolutely. I've mentioned this on the show before, but after the tournament, I went back to all the footage of the games and just counted the mistakes I made. And these weren't things that, I could have done this differently, and it's arguable what the decisions are. This was just flat out mistakes. I could have done something better. I missed a point of damage. I sequenced my plays wrong. I clicked the concede button instead of the redraw button. And I made, over the course of the broadcasted matches, I made 12 mistakes, that at least as far as I could find during the game. And this was during a tournament where I felt like I played really well. It's just, there's always room to tighten the screws. There's always room to play better. There's always room to have more agency over your outcome is how I feel about it.
Yeah, everyone's going to make mistakes. I know I do. You just admitted to doing it. Anyone who says they never make a mistake is lying to you. That's their first mistake, is thinking that they never make any.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just need other people to be able to point them out, though, because some people just aren't great at seeing where they went wrong in a game.
Speaking of, I will be rebooting the Piloting Club. If you guys are unfamiliar, the Piloting Club was an initiative started by Camomilk a few months ago where we looked closely at all these games. I'm going to be doing this in a little different fashion. If you check out the Piloting Club channel on the Friends of Eternal Discord, if you're not already following the Discord, make sure you do that, because it's the best place to get better at competitive Eternal. If you look there, you'll see that I made a post talking about how every Monday I'm actually going to spend some stream time. I'm going to be watching replays that people submit and going in depth in what I think of the plays and how, what could have been done differently. And basically I'll be just taking a magnifying glass and seeing how can we improve this? How can we tighten the screws on the gameplay?
That's a good resource. People should, go ahead and join it.
Anyway, even if you don't have someone else to look over your replays, it is incredibly beneficial to take your own magnifying glass to your own replays and see what you can do better, because like you said, outside of the heat of the moment, you might notice things that you didn't before. I know I certainly have.
Yep. And as far as playing in the tournaments go as well, prior to the tournament, I know it's hard to figure out what all of your potential opponents will be, but if you have a friend who's decent at the game, or I think SPG opened up their team for testing for day 2, once you make it, getting in some games against what your opponent will be from their side and from your side, helps a lot for knowing, for helping you identify where you're actually making the mistakes. Okay, I thought this card was good in this matchup, but it turns out it's actually pretty mediocre, or this card seemed mediocre, but it's actually been overperforming every time I draw it against them.
Yeah, my experience with that is that you'll find that the matchup hinges around certain cards. There's a card that your opponent might have that you can't really effectively deal with, or vice versa, that is really what you should be looking out for in the matchup. Or maybe there's some sort of dynamic where you have to hold on to a certain card for when your opponent plays something, because otherwise you'll lose the game. For example, if you're playing some sort of aggro deck and your opponent's playing a deck with units and Vara, you can't just throw away your permafrost. You have to wait for them to play their Vara, then permafrost it, because that's the target that needs it. Does that make sense?
Yep. And sometimes it's really hard to see, where those cards are if you only play, your side of it. But when you swap to the other side, it gets a lot easier to see, like, okay, I thought when I was playing, the red deck, I just kept getting run over by this opponent. But now that I'm on the other side, I'm getting just run over by the red deck, so clearly there's a piece here that I'm not getting about what's actually crucial to the matchup. And playing it on the other side is often helpful for figuring out what that piece is.
Absolutely. Are there any players out there that you just watch them play and you think, wow, this is top-notch gameplay. This is someone performing as well as they can, playing to all their outs, playing with like really fine attention to detail that's really maximizing their percentage in game?
Most of the time watching people is streamers, and they're obviously distracted while playing, so it's hard to play completely optimally like that. But and I've been often playing in the ECQs, so I can't watch them too much. But just from playing in them and playing against them, like Lights Out Ace, like if he's on a mid-range deck and the opponent's on any sort of mid-range deck or even control deck, like he plays very, very well in those situations. There's probably others too, but just the first one to come to my mind.
Yeah, for me, back on my Eternal Titans days when I was spectating more matches, Peak, Moosh, and Kamado were just absolute juggernauts. Seemed to always make the right decision. Either they would take the line that I was thinking of in my mind, or they'd figure out something better and take that one. So that's what I always think of when I think of people playing at their peak. Anyway, so I hope that this episode was helpful in convincing all of you out there that there's a lot that you can do to tighten up your gameplay. There's more percentage points to be won, and those percentage points are free. I mean, I think that, there are some percentage points that you can't achieve, right? There are going to be some games where you can't win and your opponent is guaranteed victory, and vice versa in card games. That's just kind of how it goes. But aside from that, these are percentage points that are up for the grabs, and I think that basically everyone out there has access to them. I think myself included. No offense, obviously, but I think that applies to you and every great player, the Boxer, Gallup, Keith Peleg. I think they're, these people who we view as top players, yes, they're amazing. They play phenomenally, but they still have room to improve. And that means that everyone does.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I wanted to say also that, when you're looking for your outs in games, sometimes you will be down, really far behind in the game, and you'll only have maybe like a 5% out of hitting something. But if you can actually, keep relatively calm and identify that, okay, my only way to win this game is, suicide attack here, sear their face, and hope to get lucky with the jack bomb, them hitting it. Go for that out if that's the only thing left for you. Don't be afraid to play to win, and not play to not lose, and don't play to not lose.
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying earlier, that's just free percentage points, right?
Yeah, you might only be 1 in 50 shot of them actually hitting their firebomb, but I mean, sometimes that's your only out, right? So
yeah, and that's what you gotta do in day 2s of tournaments to maximize your chances of victory. Thank you so much for joining me, Collector. I'm hoping to continue this series of improvement while we have a relative lull in what's going on in Eternal. For a while there, it was definitely just nonstop news and competitive play action for us to cover on this cast, but I'm hoping to get another couple episodes of how people can improve out there.
Yep, hopefully our stream of consciousness talk here will help some people with their game. So
you can always find us on Discord. We're both very approachable, friendly people, so don't be afraid to message us, or of course just send a message out in the Friends of Eternal Discord. There's plenty of people that are also willing to help out there basically any time of day and with any format in Eternal. Before we go, just one more plug for, again, the Friends of Eternal Discord and the Piloting Club, which anyone can put a link to a video of their gameplay, and I'd be happy to make comments on it. Also, of course, we would like to shout out our Friends of Eternal patrons. If you would like to support the show, you can do so at patreon.com/Friends of Eternal. You can join awesome people like Outside Bava, Yeast Out, D-Dub, Chris Ye, Chamomilk, Sigma Tank, and Work Done Son, who are quite frankly phenomenal people and help us keep doing what we're doing here. Thanks once more for joining me, Collector. Congratulations again on your victory. I am looking forward to facing off against you and other great players at Worlds, the boxer who, shows up to this show on occasion, and Bruce by God, who, he's off doing great things. So
has BBG been on this podcast?
No, he hasn't, but he has made quite a name for himself in other areas.
Oh, for sure.
It's really exciting to see. Thanks out there for listening. Hope you enjoyed this. We'll be back next week with more FECast. Until next time, we will see you in the friend zone. Friends of Eternal is awesome, but you know what's even more awesome? Our amazing patrons over at patreon.com. That's right, Friends of Eternal now has a Patreon where you can help support the content and initiatives of Friends of Eternal. If you enjoy FECast and you enjoy the Piloting Club and you want to join the people that make all this possible and sustainable, be sure to head over to patreon.com/Friends of Eternal and consider donating. Every little bit does help. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time on FECast.